What I find to be funny is that when you look at these same anecdotal reports, if I go to Reddit right now and I look at these anecdotal reports, people start complaining about creatine causing their shedding or an increased amount of hair loss within like weeks, like 2 weeks after use. Or some people even, who are a bit more paranoid, complain after 48 hours. Just to show you how crazy this space can be, you have people like that. No offense to people in the audience, but I'm just saying, like, there's no way you can notice immediate hair loss within 48 hours. Unless, you took something, maybe something toxic, right? Or maybe you were, exposed to like Nair or something crazy like that. But again, if you look at those anecdotal reports, they're saying things that would kind of fall in line with this 12-week study. Crucially, if creatine truly caused a significant hormonal shift, like raising DHT, it would have appeared in these healthy subjects. Hormones don't know if you have androgenetic alopecia or not. If creatine was going to spike DHT universally, it would have spiked in the non-androgenetic alopecia men too, but it didn't. Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another video. So, concerns have circulated online that creatine supplementation can cause hair loss, specifically male pattern baldness, or in general, androgenetic alopecia. And maybe if it doesn't cause it, it might contribute to it being accelerated. This fear largely stems from a single study over a decade ago, which reported changes in hormone levels after creatine use. However, a thorough examination of scientific evidence from that initial study to the latest clinical trials shows no direct link between creatine and hair loss. In fact, creatine is one of the most extensively studied and safest supplements available. In this video, we will break down the origin of the creatine baldness myth, examine the flaws in that argument, and review current research, including a brand new controlled trial, to demonstrate why creatine will not make you bald. So take your creatine and make those gains. Hey guys, before we continue this video, I would like to mention that we now have liposomal monoxidil sulfate on my website, folligens.com, folligens.com, and if the order queue is available and open, you can order it there. We're running it as a cosmetic. There are other sort of botanicals inside of this particular topical that are pretty helpful when it comes to conditioning the hair. So that's at folligens.com, folligens.com. That's folligens.com. Go check it out and maybe even try it out. See you there. So the origin of this myth, the creatine causes hair loss myth, can be tracked back to a 2009 study by Van der Murray and colleagues in rugby players. The title of the study is, quote, 3 weeks of creatine monohydrate supplementation affects dihydrotestosterone to testosterone ratio in college-age rugby players, unquote. Now, real quick, the word college is used differently in different countries. So in the United States, college refers to people anywhere between the ages of 18, really, to adulthood, who go to what other countries would call university. But this particular study was done in South Africa, or South Africa. Students typically here transition to college or tertiary education after completing grade 12, and this usually occurs around age 18. And typically, college can be anywhere between 4 years, depending on your program, maybe 5 years. It depends, so you're kind of looking at a range to maybe 18, at the max, 24-year-old men. That being said, in this study, 20 college-aged male rugby players took a high dose of creatine monohydrate, which would be 25 grams per day for 7 days as a loading phase, then 5 grams a day for 14 days. The researchers found that after the 7-day loading phase, the players' blood levels of dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, which is a potent derivative of testosterone, quote-unquote potent, right, had increased by 56%, and after 3 weeks of supplementation, DHT remained about 40% higher than baseline. By contrast, testosterone levels did not significantly change, And this wasn't without controversy because this finding did raise some eyebrows because of DHT's known role in androgenetic alopecia. In genetically susceptible individuals, DHT binds to the androgen receptor in hair follicles and can trigger follicle miniaturization, leading to thinning hair. In other words, more DHT can mean more hair loss for those with, again, androgenetic alopecia. But it's important to note, however, that the 2009 study was not actually about hair loss. It never measured shedding or hair follicle health, only hormone levels. The concern about balding was an interpretation based on the DHT increase. Many people assumed that if creatine elevates DHT levels, it might accelerate hair loss in men prone to balding. And this assumption turned a single hormonal finding to an alarming rumor that has persisted for decades, pretty much. So we need to understand DHT and hair loss. So again, dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, is indeed a central hormone in androgenetic alopecia. In males and even females predisposed to baldness, the hair follicles in the scalp, especially the crown and hairline areas, are very sensitive to DHT. And over there, when free testosterone is moving about, it finds these enzymes called 5-alpha reductase enzymes. And there's type 1 and type 2, and depending on the location, you have a higher concentration of type 1 and or a higher concentration of type 2. Now, in the vast majority of individuals, and there is a study that also shows this, type 2 tends to be around the hair follicles, whereas type 1 is in the sebaceous glands. But there is some sort of thought that even the type 1 5-alpha reduction of testosterone can produce DHT, and that DHT can secrete out of the sebaceous glands and then go to the hair follicle and still cause hair loss. So that's a theory out there, but nevertheless, we can come to the understanding that, yes, it's an enzymatic reaction that transforms free testosterone into DHT, and if you reduce that enzyme, 5-alpha reductase type 1 and 2, then you can possibly, and in many cases, in the majority of cases, you can halt hair loss, slow it down, or even, if you're early enough, reverse this androgenetic alopecia-based hair loss. So really quickly, I'm here in the post-edit, but I wanted to flag why in vivo versus in vitro actually matters here. So really quickly, in vivo studies are conducted on whole living organisms like animals or humans. Just think of it as the entire organism, and it shows a complex biological process and environment. However, in vitro studies, you are performing a controlled laboratory experiment where you're cutting out a piece of cells or tissue, an organ, and then you're isolating it and you're examining it in a specific biological context. And with hair follicles, we can see in this specific context between 5-alpha reductase type 1 and type 2 expression, we can have a really good example as to why in vivo versus in vitro actually matters. So I'm going to talk about that right now. So there's a Merck-affiliated paper from 1999 titled, quote, Immunohistochemical Localization of Types 1 and 2 5-alpha reductase in Human Scalp, unquote, by Bain et al. That reported they did not see 5-alpha reductase type 2 expressed in the dermal papilla, and type 1 was prominently expressed in the sebaceous gland. And as a reminder, the dermal papilla, that particular area of the hair follicle, is important when it comes to regulating the health of the hair follicle. It actually controls its growth, right? So if the 5-alpha reductase enzymes are there, depending on which are there, it dictates the production of DHT. And once DHT is produced in the dermal papilla, it will connect to the androgen receptors in those cells, and then it will message certain signals. If you have, again, the genetics for male pattern baldness or androgenetic alopecia, that DHT connecting to those dermal papilla cells and their androgen receptors will send messages to essentially tell the dermal papilla to, hey, let's kill this hair follicle over time. Now, keep in mind, this particular study used hair follicles that were biopsied and examined in vitro. But then, Asada et al. 2001, in their paper titled, quote, 5-alpha reductase type 2 is constitutively expressed in the dermal papilla and connective tissue sheath of hair follicle in vivo but not during culture in vitro, unquote, used micro-dissected human follicles with RT-PCR plus immunostaining and did find 5-alpha reductase type 2 in the dermopapilla and connective tissue sheath in living tissues. Now, I want you guys to understand the method that Asada et al. Used in order to discover that 5-alpha reductase type 2 presence is actually detectable in the dermopapilla. Now, there's this thing called mRNA, or messenger RNA, in cells. And the duty of mRNA is to carry protein information from the DNA in a cell's nucleus to the cell's cytoplasm, where the protein-making machinery reads that mRNA sequence and then it essentially says, okay, let's start creating things. And in this instance, it's creating an enzyme, either 5-alpha reductase type 1 or 5-alpha reductase type 2. And these enzymes are also known as proteins. So if you can detect a certain presence of an mRNA sequence in a bit of a tissue sample, you essentially are detecting that, okay, that presence is there. Perhaps that means there was a production of a particular protein. So once you examine that mRNA sequence, you can find out what that protein is. And in this case, Asada et al. Found out that that mRNA sequence related to the production and the general creation of 5-alpha reductase type 2. So you have to do this method called PCR. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction, and this is a technique used in laboratories to rapidly copy billions of a specific strand of DNA segments from a sample. So the advantages here is that if you have a small bit of a sample and you want to find out what mRNA sequences are represented in that sample, you essentially use the PCR method, and then it shows you, hey, you have these mRNA sequences that are detected in this tissue sample, and now you have a greater understanding on what's going on in that tissue. And that is what Asada et al. Used to determine that, yes, type 2 5-alpha reductase is in the dermopapilla. And this is precisely why in vivo versus in vitro studies matter. Because just in this context of hair loss alone, when we're taking out a tissue, when we're taking up the hair follicle from a human scalp or from a mouse or a pig or whatever, we're cutting lots of tissue. And those tissues could be providing cells that have special signals that would influence the hair follicle to act in a particular way. Now, if you remove those tissues in those niche cellular environments and you just put that hair follicle into a petri dish, it's missing a great degree of context. And there may be some context that we can't detect by just using PCR methods. Maybe we have to use more advanced methods, right? So that's why in vivo and in vitro matters, because you're not getting the full context of how that organ is actually operating or those cells are actually operating in vivo if you're just taking it and putting it in vitro. Hopefully that makes sense. So, again, over time, exposure to DHT in these sensitive hair follicles leads to visible hair thinning and balding. Medications like finasteride, brand name Propecia, help treat hair loss by reducing DHT production, blocking that 5-alpha reductase enzyme, and also you have dutasteride, which is a dual 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, which can lower type 1 and type 2 5-alpha reductase. And again, for finasteride, it's primarily a type 2 inhibitor and a very, very weak type 1 inhibitor. But dutasteride is a stronger type 2 inhibitor, again, even stronger than finasteride, but also it is a pretty strong type 1 inhibitor. So, given this well-known mechanism, it's understandable why a spike in DHT from creatine raised some concerns. Now, if a supplement caused a sustained increase in DHT, it could theoretically worsen hair loss in someone who's genetically predisposed to it. However, the context here is critical. The body's hormone levels fluctuate due to many factors, even if you're on finasteride and dutasteride. So age, time of day, diet, stress, even especially in this case, because we're talking about these rugby players who were lifting weights or exercising, even exercising can impact your hormonal levels. If you're doing resistance training, we have tons of data that shows this. You're going to see an increase in your androgens. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a crazy increase to the point where it's going to speed up your hair loss, because your body, in many ways, in some ways, is making use of that sort of free testosterone or androgens in some case to repair tissue. So with that being said, an acute rise in DHT, especially if still within the normal physiological range, is not the same as a chronic hormonal disorder. So before concluding creatine causes baldness, we need to scrutinize whether that 2009 finding was significant, reproducible, and relevant to real-world hair loss. And it wasn't, because there were a lot of flaws in this 2009 rugby player study. So let's examine that. One of the biggest flaws here is that the study did not measure free testosterone levels at all. This is notable because free testosterone is the fraction available to be converted to DHT via that 5-alpha reductase enzymatic activity. Without free T data, we lack a complete picture of the hormone changes. An unexplained rise in DHT without changes in total T raises questions, possibly the result of normal physiological variation or even testing conditions rather than a direct effect of creatine. Crucially, the creatine group and the placebo group had different DHT levels before supplementation. In fact, the creatine group's average DHT baseline was about 23% lower than the placebo group. So we're looking at 0.98 nanomoles per liter versus 1.26 nanomoles per liter. This means that the creatine group had more room, essentially, to increase. Indeed, after a week on creatine, their DHT rose roughly to plus 0.55 nanomoles per liter, while the placebo group's DHT decreased by minus 0.17 nanomoles per liter over that same time period. Statistically, this made it look like a big between-group jump in DHT, but in absolute terms, the values in both groups were well within normal physiological ranges for DHT. In other words, the 56% increase was an artifact of a lower starting point and a slight placebo drop rather than an abnormal surge to off-the-chart levels. All DHT values reported stayed in the normal healthy range for young men, approximately 0.8 to 3.5 nanomole per liter. The peak DHT on creatine was approximately 1.53 nanomole per liter, was still completely typical for an 18 to 35-year-old male. For perspective, DHT levels can vary day to day, and even hour to hour within that range. The body's natural fluctuations, or the effect of intense training, yes, if you're lifting weights and you're doing intense resistance training exercises, right, this is going to impact your hormonal levels. Strenuous resistance exercise itself acutely influences testosterone and DHT levels, and we have plenty of studies on that. You can look it up online too. I don't think this is the video to necessarily go over this. Also, I think it's worth to mention, because this wasn't a dermatological study, there was no measure of scalp DHT or tissue DHT of any kind. And the reason why we're interested about this is because in androgenetic alopecia, it is the local levels of DHT that can determine how you lose your hair. And many people don't know this, but your serum DHT is actually a partial reflection, I guess you can say, a partial reflection on what's going on in your tissue, but it's not a complete reflection. Tissue DHT, your body, produces DHT as a paracrine hormone, so that means it's locally produced at a site of a particular tissue, is made in that tissue, and then it kind of leaks into the bloodstream, into the serum. And then based on your serum, if your DHT in the tissue is going up or going down, but again, maybe for some reason, certain tissues aren't leaking as much. Maybe your liver's not leaking as much, and maybe your prostate isn't leaking as much, and your hair follicles could still have all the DHT it needs to essentially progress androgenetic alopecia. So in theory, that could also be a sort of reflection, right? Or maybe it could be the case where you're having your liver and other tissues in your body leaking a lot of DHT, but in the hair follicles on your scalp, right, it's not necessarily releasing or leaking too much DHT because locally those levels have reduced. But you wouldn't get that from a blood test. A serum DHT test wouldn't show you that. What you would probably need is some sort of sebum analysis, or maybe, and again, I don't want to recommend this because people tend to go overboard with this, maybe a scalp biopsy where they can kind of quantify the amount of DHT in that particular tissue sample. But that's kind of unnecessary. But the takeaway point here is this study, this rugby player study, didn't even measure tissue DHT. So that's something to kind of consider. I also want to go back, now that I'm thinking about it, on the exercising part, right? So again, the strenuous resistance exercise itself can acutely influence testosterone and DHT levels. But also, it might be the case that with creatine, you're able to put in more reps, right? We already know this from many studies. This isn't the point of the video to go over creatine, exercising, but you can put in more reps than you typically wouldn't be able to, right? And in doing so, maybe the people who are putting in more reps because they're on creatine are probably causing perhaps a greater surge in their testosterone and DHT levels because they're able to damage more tissues and put in more, I guess you can say, work. And in turn, the body responds by producing more androgens along with other sort of hormones. A big red flag here is that no other study over the next decade could reproduce the supposed DHT raising effect. Dozens of creatine studies followed since then, and they examine everything from strength gains to blood markers, and none conclusively showed a spike in DHT. In fact, many investigations looked at testosterone levels with creatine and found no significant changes. Now, we're going to have a look at Antonio et al. 2021 in their paper titled, quote, Common Questions and Misconceptions about Creatine Supplementation. What does the scientific evidence really show? Unquote. The paper goes on to say, quote, to date, 12 other studies have investigated the effects of creatine supplementation, i.e. doses ranging from 3 to 25 grams per day for 6 days to 12 weeks on testosterone, unquote. And of those studies, of those 12 studies, 10 studies reported no change in testosterone concentrations, and only two, reported small, physiologically insignificant increases in testosterone after 6 to 7 days of supplementation. Free testosterone was measured in 5 of those studies, and no increases were found. So Antonio et al. Conclude by saying, quote, in summary, the current body of evidence does not indicate creatine supplementation increases total testosterone, free testosterone, DHT, or cause hair loss / baldness, unquote. So with that information in mind, if it's not even increasing free testosterone or total testosterone, where's all the excess supposed DHT coming from? And if it's only increasing it by very small, physiologically insignificant amounts, then if you're losing hair and you're saying, oh, it's because of my creatine usage, it's not because of your creatine. And that's why this whole rugby player study was such a distraction, and it's been one for quite some time. So now we can actually get some real context by looking at a study that has to deal with creatine and hair loss, and we're going to be having a sort of dermatological overview of things. To directly address the question, does creatine cause hair loss, researchers in 2025 conducted a rigorous randomized controlled trial, the first study specifically designed to examine creatine's impact on hair-related outcomes. Locke et al. 2025 recruited 45 healthy young men between the ages of 18 to 40 years old with weight training experience and assigned them to either a creatine monohydrate group or a placebo group for 12 weeks. Importantly, The trial excluded men who had early signs of male pattern baldness or who were on any hair loss treatments to ensure that existing hair loss or medications wouldn't muddy the results. This allowed a clear assessment of what creatine alone does in terms of hormones and even, maybe to a slightly lesser effect, hair parameters. And I say to a slightly lesser effect because it's only 12 weeks. In reality, I wish this study went on for, maybe 24 weeks being 6 months. But, we have to deal with what we have. I think the bulk of the data that was corrected kind of does vindicate, hey, creatine does not cause hair loss, right? Nor is it going to contribute in any sort of meaningful way. All right, so let's go over the study design. So the creatine group took a standard maintenance dose of 5 grams per day, no high loading phase, while the placebo group took an identical looking placebo pill. So they took a pill that looked like the creatine pill, but it had no active ingredient, it was just sugar. The study was double-blinded, meaning neither the participants nor the investigators knew who was taking creatine versus placebo until the end. Both groups continued their normal diets, workout routines, etc., etc. The researchers measured a comprehensive set of outcomes before and after the 12 weeks. So here are those outcomes, right? So first, hormones. They measured total testosterone, free testosterone, and DHT levels in the blood. Next, hair follicle health. Now, they had a detailed analysis using phototrichogram imaging on the scalp, and they also measured hair density, being hairs per centimeter square, total hair count, the percentages of hairs in the growth phase, so anagen versus the resting phase, telogen, and this is known as the anagen to telogen ratio. They also measured the percentage of terminal or thick hairs versus fine, also known as vellus hairs. They also measured out hair shaft thickness and the number of follicular units, among plenty of other metrics. So essentially, they looked for any sign of hair thinning, growth, or anything to do with change, right? They had this huge net, and they wanted to find if anything were to be impacted in the hair cycle, they would know, right? Maybe the hair keeps growing, but maybe the hair that grows somehow becomes, thinner in width because of creatine use. Who knows? So that's why they had a really good study design when it comes to their metrics, right? So what were the results? Well, after 3 months, the findings were very clear. Creatine had no adverse effect on any hormone or hair outcome compared to placebo. So there were no DHT increases. And unlike the 2009 study, this trial is really just focusing on hair loss too. So the fact that now we have no statistically significant, increases or decreases of DHT in the context of creatine and hair loss, we can kind of say that, okay, now we know in a dermatologically, sound study, creatine isn't doing anything when it comes to hair. It's not going to make you lose hair. So the DHT differences between the groups were statistically pretty much identical at the end of the 12 weeks, of course, compared to week 0. So consequently, the ratio of DHT to testosterone also showed no difference between groups. So now moving on to total testosterone. Total testosterone did not significantly differ between creatine and placebo groups. There was a trend that, over time, total testosterone levels rose slightly in both groups, placebo included, which the authors attributed to normal seasonal or hormonal variations. The study ran from late summer into fall, so maybe that can be considered. But critically, creatine did not cause the total testosterone to spike above what was seen in the placebo group. If anything here, right, keep this in mind, if anything, the placebo group had an equal or a larger increase in T on average. So when we look at free testosterone, it actually showed a modest decrease over time in both groups. And this is a common response to intensive training or seasonal change, as free testosterone can inversely fluctuate with changes in binding proteins. Again, this change was independent of creatine use. So essentially, this is something that was happening in both groups, and creatine wasn't influencing it by any means. So now when we look at the changes in hair measurement, every measure of hair growth that the authors use or hair loss remained the same between the creatine and placebo groups. There was no change or drop in density, no increase in the proportion of thin vellus hairs to, thick terminal hairs, and no change in hair count on the scalp for those taking creatine. If creatine were silently harming hair follicles through some sort of mechanism like DHT or another mysterious mechanism, it would likely show up in at least one of these quantitative measures after 3 months, but there was nothing. In both groups, hair metrics stayed essentially stable, and any tiny changes were equivalent between creatine and placebo. In the researchers' words themselves, they say, quote, "We did not find any differences in any hair outcome," unquote, due to creatine supplementation. Now, this new trial is a pivotal piece of evidence because it directly measured what people care about, hair loss, rather than just assuming based on hormones. It also addressed the short-term nature of the 2009 study, the rugby player study, by running for a longer period of time, 3 months instead of 3 weeks, and the 3-week study was from the 2009, again, rugby player study. And by using a typical maintenance dose without an unnatural loading phase, we have a pretty measured paper here by Locke and colleagues. Moreover, the study design was robust, randomized, placebo-controlled, and double-blinded. Now, the sample size is a bit small. However, if we compare that to the Vandermeer et al., again, that rugby player study that everyone based their whole sort of creatine causes hair loss reasoning on, that study only had 20 participants. And this most recent study from Locke and colleagues has around 38 participants with a very high compliance. This credibility for the paper is further strengthened by the fact that the trial was conducted independently at a university research center and had no funding from supplement companies. Now, there are some people who might say, well, hey, there's a section that shows a conflict of interest of some kind because some of the authors worked at supplement companies at one point in their lives.
Problem number one is that the authors of this study are scientific advisors to a creatine supplement company.
Guys, this is a clinical trial, right? It took place, I think, at the University of Iran or some university in the country of Iran. And during clinical trial processes, you guys have to remember, it's not always the authors that are directly interfacing and carrying out the clinical trial process, right? It's usually going to be an investigator. And these investigators are hired by the government, right? So it's maybe, Iran's version of the FDA, right? So they're the ones that are essentially going to be doing the clinical trial process, going to be recording the measurements, and then they hand off the statistics to Locke and colleagues, and then they kind of have to make sense of what's going on, right? But the conclusions were already made. That's why the paper is kind of just synthesizing everything that's been put together. So there's a lot of skepticism here, but I don't really think it's appropriate, right? Again, people in this space, if you're a researcher in this space, you're going to have at one point in time maybe worked at a company, worked at a pharmaceutical company of some kind. It is what it is, right? Just look at the merits of the paper and assess it rather than just casting doubt. You need some actual proof to say, oh, this was influenced by so-and-so company. It wasn't. It was the trial was being funded by, public money. So it is what it is.
Problem number two with this study is that it wasn't actually conducted on individuals with a male pattern hair loss diagnosis, also called androgenetic alopecia. When you're studying any condition, whether you're studying the causes or the treatments of that condition, you want the participants inside of your study to actually have that condition. Otherwise, you might draw false conclusions.
Now, let's get on to the concerns about this study, right? I already mentioned one, and that's the whole, well, this is being funded by a secret dark entity supplement company, right? Okay, I already addressed that. But now, let's look at some of the comments where people are like, but, this study didn't include men who are already balding. And people might argue, if you don't include men that are already balding, right? What if creatine affects them differently? And it's true that this 2025 randomized clinical trial studied men without obvious androgenetic alopecia, but this was by design, and it's to keep the sample homogeneous. And this is actually the strength of the study. You see, including men with active hair loss could introduce lots of noise. Their follicles are already shrinking from genetic factors, from factors that would independently occur outside of creatine use. And many might be on medications like finasteride or minoxidil, which could drastically alter DHT dynamics. So if those men were included, any changes could be misattributed to creatine, when in fact, it could just be a natural progression of androgenetic alopecia or the effects of their hair treatment. Think about this. Even if they were on finasteride 4 months ago, okay, the fact that they're off now, they could be going through a shedding phase. Then you start the study, and then, oh my goodness, here's what's happening. Maybe they tried minoxidil a month ago, and then they quit, and now they're in the shedding phase. Or maybe they started minoxidil, and now they're about to end it. There's just too much noise. So by studying men who don't have obvious signs of androgenetic alopecia, the trial cleanly isolated creatine's effects on hormones and hair without the confounders. If creatine truly caused a significant hormonal shift, like raising DHT, it would have appeared in these healthy subjects. Hormones don't know if you have androgenetic alopecia or not. If creatine was going to spike DHT universally, it would have spiked in the non-androgenetic alopecia men too, but it didn't. And hey guys, you can possibly argue that maybe it's the case that some of these men in the study already had a degree of androgenetic alopecia. It's a very, very common, disorder, especially as you go up in age. So they probably do have the genetics for the gene, whether it's aggressive or not, it's there. So if the DHT is increasing, right, maybe it should be able to cause them to shed and lose some sort of quality in their hair. But again, it didn't. None of that happened. Moreover, if the claim is that creatine accelerates balding only in those predisposed, we should have seen or heard of clear patterns of that in the real world by now. Okay, I know. We hear it from many people on forums and on TikTok and on YouTube. Everyone, on Reddit, they might say, oh, hey, I tried creatine and I'm losing my hair. Because right now the myth has propagated so much, right? But there's a reason why you don't see that in literature, in controlled settings, and not just in the halls of internet online forums that have trolls that like to spread bullshit. So because we have a lack of red flags in case reports or epidemiological studies, we have something called a lack of a signal. Now, what does a signal mean, right? When people say, there's no signal, there's no signal. A signal in pharmacovigilance, and pharmacovigilance is the practice of being vigilant of medicines and their effects on a population. A signal is essentially a string of evidence that kind of points at a specific problem, right? If you're noting that, hey, when people take this medication, it seems like lately, this new drug that came on the market, everyone keeps coming back with these sort of weird rashes and heart problems, and, they have green hair now, right? What's going on with that? Well, if this happens, once or twice, it's whatever. But if this is consistently happening over time and there's literature to support it and, case reports and doctors complaining and such, this is what we call a signal. So not all signals essentially, verify that a problem actually exists. Just because it's a signal, it doesn't mean that it's a real thing. A signal just indicates to researchers and pharmacovigilance organizations to, hey, Let's go check that out. Let's go see what's going on. You might remember earlier this year, to an extent late last year of 2024, there was a sort of review being done on finasteride by the European Medicines Agency. Why? Because they were able to accrue an ample amount of signals, so to speak, that caused them to go back and review and check if finasteride or dutasteride are indeed safe drugs. And the signal here is that some people complain about a thing called post-finasteride syndrome. Now, again, like I said, just because there's a signal, it doesn't mean that what the supposed signal is talking about, it doesn't mean that it's verifying a condition, right? It's just telling researchers, hey, people are complaining about shit. Let's go check it out. And to be fair, there have been a lot of signals on like Reddit forums and such like that. But lately, when it comes to creatine, those signals aren't happening in academia, right? They're not happening in papers. At least with post-finasteride syndrome, you have some papers that are coming out about it, even though they might be bullshit papers. It's still better in quality than some random people chatting about shit on Reddit or YouTube comment section. So that's why it's important here. So there's no signal, and I went through the literature, there are no substantial signals that link creatine to hair loss. And mind you, creatine is one of the most studied supplements in the world. This thing has so much data on it. It's kind of crazy. I'll put the paper or the book in the comment section titled, quote, Safety of Creatine Supplementation, unquote, by Adam M. Persky and Eric S. Rawson. They essentially just go over the body of literature when it comes to creatine. And it's really good. It has some really good use in muscle dysfunction and memory and cognition in general. So with a sort of supplement that has been studied to this extent, you would assume by now we would have gotten ample amounts of signals that essentially say, hey, this thing is dangerous, but we have gotten none. Besides people just bitching on, Reddit and stuff like that. I think the fact that there's an absence of any notable hair loss trends in the literature among creatine users, even those with androgenetic alopecia, aligns with the data showing no hormonal impact. So in essence, the burden of proof is on the myth at this point. Given the lack of evidence, we should not assume a sort of hidden effect on balding men without concrete data suggesting so. So, including balding men literally would have just made this study very confusing and useless. Because once more, any ongoing hair loss could falsely be blamed on creatine. The proper approach here is to first see if creatine alters the known trigger, being DHT, or causes hair changes in a controlled setting, which it does not. I don't think I've made this clear, so I want to reiterate again. In androgenetic alopecia, it's DHT that drives hair loss. If DHT isn't raising by any significant means or at all due to creatine use, why would it matter if it's happening in either a man with AGA or a man without AGA, right? This factor, DHT, your body doesn't, the DHT in your body doesn't know, hey, you have the genes for hair loss. If it's going to raise DHT, it's going to raise DHT, but it doesn't. Another point that I want to add, I just forgot about this, but I want to add it here, is that women take creatine too. If creatine was raising their DHT, they would have beards. We would see tons of reports of women growing beards and being virilized and having deep voices and being muscular. But we don't get that. What is creatine like Anavar at this point? Like the bullshit myth that is creatine causing hair loss and doing all sorts of crazy things, raising your testosterone. Look, if you guys don't want to use it, don't fucking use it. Just don't use it, right? But don't let your weak anecdotes influence other people because you're too scared shitless to use creatine. It's not even required. Another complaint is that, 3 months isn't long enough. Hair loss can take longer to manifest.
For these individuals, if they have a DHT sensitivity, we need to see multiple hair cycles to measure the rates of miniaturization in between the hair cycling. It could be that Creatine doesn't lead to massive disruptions to the hair cycle itself, but that in between hair cycles, miniaturization can be more pronounced for those taking creatine versus not taking creatine.
And, this is true. Hair growth is a slow process. Follicles cycle through growth and rest phases that span months. However, if creatine were going to trigger hair loss, we would likely see early warning signs in a few months. For instance, when someone starts a medication or a supplement that negatively affects hair, an increase in daily shedding or a drop in hair density often becomes noticeable within weeks to a few months, because susceptible hairs can prematurely enter the shedding phase, the telogen phase. The 12-week study looked at very sensitive measures of healthy hair and saw no downward trends whatsoever that could be attributed to creatine use. If anything, 3 months is kind of plenty of time to see a change in DHT to translate to some hair effect. If we're going to make any sort of statements, we should probably look at the rugby player study, because the rugby player study was 6 weeks? Probably less than that. Yet people walked away saying, oh, well, look at this study. This proves baldness is going to occur, right? It's funny how that study, which was shorter than this new one, and by the way, that rugby study had nothing to do with dermatology whatsoever. It's funny how people hold on to that one, but this new paper, there's all sorts of skepticism in the world. Have your skepticism, but just be honest about where it's coming from. Be honest in your assessment, because you're clearly not holding, these two things in regard. You're holding one, above the other, and the one that you're holding above the other, right, assuming you support this myth, is the rugby player study that has nothing to do with hair loss metrics. And in fact, when it comes to hormonal measurements, the paper that's about hair here in this case by Locke and colleagues literally is being ignored by some of these, anti-creatine people. I'm already getting just annoyed talking about this, to be honest. And what I find to be funny is that when you look at these same anecdotal reports, right? If I go to Reddit right now and I look at these anecdotal reports, people start complaining about creatine causing their shedding or an increased amount of hair loss within weeks, 2 weeks after use. Or some people even, who are a bit more paranoid, complain after 48 hours. Just to show you how crazy this space can be, you have people like that. No offense to people in the audience, but I'm just saying, there's no way you can notice immediate hair loss within 48 hours. Unless, you took something that you weren't supposed to take, maybe something toxic, or maybe you were, exposed to Nair or something crazy like that. But the anecdotal reports are all essentially saying that the shedding, when it comes to creatine use, is occurring days or weeks into the creatine's use. So if we can believe those anecdotal reports, then the time frame in the Locke and colleagues study, the most recent study that concerns whether or not creatine causes hair loss, the 3 months in its assessment period should be a reasonable window if we're going to accept people's days and weeks into creatine usage causing hair loss or increased shedding. So, hello everyone, we're actually here in Visual Studio Code. I actually went ahead and wrote a little program to pull posts and comments from the r/Tresla subreddit that mention both creatine and shedding. So let's have a look at this program over here. Here's how it works. It's pretty simple. First, I collected all the posts and comments that had both terms, creatine, shedding, and other sort of slang terms and misspelling, different variations and such. So you can see it over here, creatine terms, creatine, crea over here, monohydrate, everything over here, right? We use some regular expression too, and I'll post the code maybe on GitHub so you guys can see for yourself and maybe play with it. But I also made a list over here of shedding terms as well. And then I looked for the time references, like after 2 weeks or on day 30, so on and so forth. You can see over here. Over here in the duration pattern section, this uses regular expression. And once I had the numbers, I plotted different graphs to see how shedding reports are spread out over time. And we can go to that real quick. But after cleaning the data, I ended up with 426 posts that included a duration. When I looked at those posts, the median time it took for people to report shedding was around 60 days. So I have a window over here that we can kind of look at. So over here, right? Duration summary. Median time it took for people to report shedding was 60 days. The average time was a bit higher at around 94 days, so 93.868, so on and so forth. This I will show you later. There were some parts of the data that kind of pulled up the average due to how significantly long it took for some users to report. Again, this is all anecdotal summaries. Don't take it as scientific fact, but some people reported their shedding at around a year and a half. So that's bringing up the sort of mean days that it took for people to report shedding, the average days. And we can see over here, a quarter of reports essentially stated shedding happened at around 20 days, and 3/4 stated that shedding happened at around 135 days over here, as you can see from P25 days and P75 days. So percentile 25 and percentile 75. And the minimum amount of days it took to report shedding was only 2 days. And over here, the maximum amount was 540 days. So again, that 540 days sort of outlier that somebody reported is bringing up the mean average. My overall takeaway before I go in depth into the other graphs is that most reports of creatine-related shedding on Reddit, at least on the trustless subreddit, cluster in the first few weeks to the first couple of months. But I just want to say this before we look at the other graphs. People have to understand that these are anecdotal reports. They're not scientific. However, for the past, 20, maybe 25 years, people have only accepted anecdotal reports when it comes to creatine and hair loss, right? So how can we accept anecdotal reports of people saying creatine caused their hair loss or their hair shedding within the first 1 to 3 months? How can we say that's valid? But when there's a study that has a methodology specifically for creatine and hair loss, and that methodology essentially is a 3-month-long sort of study, how can we say, well, that is a bit too short, right? That's a bit too short for it to be significant in terms of monitoring any sort of hair changes. When in reality, when you look at how people report shedding with creatine and hair loss, it seems to be that 1 to 3 months is perfectly fine. It's enough time for us to at least capture a signal, a sort of indication that hair shedding is occurring, right? So I'm just giving more credit to the recent hair loss creatine study, where that study pretty soundly debunks the fact, or the notion, not the fact, the notion that creatine causes hair loss. So you guys can calm down a bit. So looking at this graph over here, titled, quote, "The distribution of reported shedding onset after starting creatine" from R. Tressless, we can see some pretty interesting things about this histogram. So again, these bars over here, these bins, shows us how many mentions land at each time range. The taller the bars means more reports around that time. You can see that most of the bars are tallest in the earlier ranges, right? So the tallest bars tend to be between 0 to 90 days, right? You got some people in between over here, but for the most part, 0 to 90 days, it seems that's when you have people reporting sheds. So 1 to 3 months, 1 to 4 months should be fine. And if we are to look at another graph, let me scroll all the way down here, the way down over here. Give me a moment. Over here, this is just another histogram with more bins, more intricate looks, right? Again, once more, we can see over here, 0 to 21, 0 to 42, 63. Again, most of the sort of complaints are coming between 1 to 3 months, 1 to 4 months, if we're generous, 1 to 5 months, right? But most of it is 1 to 3 months. So in this particular graph, the ECDF graph, and that stands for the empirical cumulative distribution function, we can see the cumulative share of users reporting shedding by day. So what's actually going on here? The y-axis goes from 0 to 1, so 0% to 100%. And the x-axis is showing us the number of days. The interpretation is essentially this. At the beginning, the line is flat and you have nobody reporting anything. So essentially over here, right, at the sort of origin point. And then it rises sharply, which means many people reported shedding in that time window, right? So it goes like, whoop, it goes up pretty quickly. And when it rises sharply, that means you're essentially seeing a lot of reports coming through. And most of this this steep rise is happening within the first few weeks to months, meaning that's when the majority of shedding is noticed by these people in this data set. So by around, let's say, maybe 135 days or so, maybe a bit more than that over here, maybe 168 or so, right? About 75% of all reports have already appeared. So in plain English, this graph is essentially telling us how quickly people reported shedding after starting creatine. And most of the curve climbs early, which means shedding is usually happening early, according to these people, according to this data set, within the first couple months of creatine use. So that just validates that new creatine study that everyone is talking about, which I'm months late for this particular segment. So let's go on to another section, right? Okay, so now we're here looking at the box plot, right? So what does the box plot show us? So first, let's look at the y-axis. As it's titled, the y-axis states the days until users reported shedding. And this goes from as low as 0 days all the way up to 546 days. The x-axis over here is just a category label, so I didn't feel the need to split people into different groups. It's just one group's all the mentions. Maybe if I had looked at different subreddits, I could have done r/lists and so on and so forth, right? But let's look at the key over here. The key over here tells us the yellow line is 25th percentile, the median is the red line, and the 75th percentile is the green line. So the 25th percentile is at around 20 or 21 days, right? Pretty close. And this means that 25% of people in this data set reported shedding within the first 20 days. The red line over here, this red dashed line, is the median. So it took 60 days. So at this point, half of the people reported shedding before 60 days. The top part of the box over here, the blue box, is the 75th percentile. And it is around, I can say, maybe we can say this is 135 days, right? So this means after 135 days, 75% of people reported shedding. And this is around 4 to 5 months. So mostly, right? Mostly you're looking at 1 to 3 months or so from how long it took to people to essentially report shedding, right? That's a perfect range for this new study. And I think it's perfectly fine for us to use that as a sort of rationale to build our methodology on. Now, it would have been nice if they went on to 6 months or a year, but let's not sort of say this study is not that good because it was only for 3 months when all of the anecdotal reports give us a signal that we should see something in 1 to 3 months. So further looking at this plot, we can look at the whiskers, so the lines above the box over here, and the lines below the box. So the lower whisker is down at around, I would say, maybe it's 2 days or so, right? That 2-day thing that we had in the summary report. So that means somebody in this data set reported that they noticed shedding after 2 days of using creatine. Very, very unrealistic, but that's what you get when you play with anecdotes, right? And then we have people reporting shedding all the way up to what could possibly be, I don't know how you would see this. Maybe this is a bit above 294 days. So maybe 200 or 300 days. That's pretty high. But then we can look at the outliers of the whisker plot. So each gray circle is an outlier of people who reported shedding later than most of the people in this data set. Some outliers go up to 540 days, 1.5 years. And these are rare cases, but they are pulling up the average, which is around 94 days. So in reality, the average is lower than that. It's just that you have to take into account the one guy or 2 guys or whatever that reported 540 days or 1.5 years until they noticed their hair shedding due to creatine use. So what this means in plain English is that most people who say creatine caused shedding on trust lists notice it between 3 to 4 weeks, or really a month, right? So again, let's just say it's between 1 to 3 months, right? Let's just say it's between 1 to 3 months, maybe 4 months, right? It doesn't matter. It's somewhere in that sort of range. We can go back and look at the histogram over here, right? It's somewhere between 0 months up to, let's be generous, 4 months or, 3 months. It's somewhere between that range. Now, we do have the violin. It's pretty much showing us, this violin distribution plot is showing us the same thing, right? We're seeing a huge cluster at the 1 to 3 month range, right? And it's, again, the same story. I don't really have to go through all these charts to kind of reiterate to this point that the anecdotal reports, if we're going to use them as a justification for the time it takes to cause hair loss due to creatine, then it should be perfectly fine in terms of a methodology window of 3 months when it comes to actually observing creatine and hair loss in a study. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you guys can understand what I'm saying. I have this sore in my mouth and it really hurts to speak. But yeah, I'm just going to drop this in there. Hopefully my editor can, fix it and put it where it's truly relevant. Anyway, that's it for this part. See ya. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is a application that I made, a little mini, program that I made on my computer that essentially goes throughout the r/Tressless subreddit. And as you can see, yeah, it looks like people are reporting that their shedding occurred pretty early into creatine use, right? It didn't take 4, 5, 8, 16 months for them to notice this. They're apparently saying this thing happened, weeks into, to like at least a month, right, of use, at least a month of use. So is this really a bad study design all of a sudden, right? It looks like it follows the same duration that people talk about. 3 months seems like it's long enough. Again, it could be 6 months. I would have loved if they went up to 6 months. It would have shut out a lot of criticism, but I'm sure people would have found excuses. But you can see here, once more, this is not an issue. Now, another criticism would be, hey, serum DHT isn't the same as scalp DHT. Creatine might be affecting hair follicles without showing up in blood tests. That might be a criticism that could be raised.
I don't necessarily think that blood levels of DHT are even the right marker to be measuring to make that biological argument. It's not blood levels of DHT that matter. It's scalp levels of DHT that matter the most.
And this is a theoretical concern, because could creatine somehow increase DHT levels only in the scalp or make hair follicles more sensitive without raising blood DHT levels? Currently, there's no known mechanism for creatine to do this. Almost all known causes of pattern hair loss, like hormonal changes or steroids, involve systemic hormone changes or direct action on androgen receptors. And creatine does not have action on androgen receptors, and it doesn't have any sort of direct androgenic activity itself. So it's not a hormone or even a signaling molecule. It's a nutrient that helps recycle energy in muscle cells. There's no evidence that creatine interacts with the endocrine system in a way that would increase local DHT in tissues. In fact, if creatine did anything to upregulate DHT at the tissue level, we'd expect to see systemic hints of androgenic activity. Like I mentioned before, you would see things in women, for example, if they take creatine. Women that take creatine would have beards, would have mustaches, would virilize. That's a really strong point that people often miss out on. So you have to be really, mindful of your criticisms here. You would see people having more acne, more oily skin, increased body hair too. Or maybe in men, everyone that's taking creatine, they would have issues urinating because their prostate would have become large due to a supposed androgenic effect of creatine. And yet, in the decades of its use, no study has reported any of this. And another thing I want people to consider is this. So beyond controlled studies, it's useful to just take a step back and look at population and, sort of evolutionary context. Guys, creatine is not a foreign substance to the body. It's an amino acid derived compound found in various foods and produced endogenously. We make our own creatine every day. If you're eating an omnivorous diet, then it essentially provides a baseline intake of creatine daily, especially if it includes meat or fish. For example, about 1 pound of raw beef or salmon contains roughly 1 to 2 grams of creatine. Certain fish, like herring, are exceptionally high and can provide up to 3 to 4 grams of creatine per pound. This means that people who eat meat and fish regularly are already ingesting quantities of creatine comparable to the supplement dose. If creatine as a molecule were inherently bad for hair, we'd expect to see correlations like meat eaters go bald more than vegetarians because of creatine, which is not the case. There is no epidemiological link between dietary creatine intake and hair loss prevalence. Hair loss incidence varies across populations and mostly due to things like genetics, age, and perhaps hormonal or environmental factors, but not due to how much steak or fish one eats. Likewise, if taking 5 grams of creatine daily posed a hair risk, we would have likely seen thousands of reports by now. No, not online form reports, right? I'm talking about case studies, clinical trials, and such. But another thing I want people to consider is that some of these athletes and bodybuilders who take creatine, they have something like mentally going on with them, right? And I've seen it many times on Reddit. This might be a bit of an anecdotal sort of story. But, I know this guy, right? This is back at my university when I was working out. I still do work out, but, when I did more workouts frequently, he would say things like, oh man, this creatine is causing me to lose hair. I'm losing hair because of the creatine. And I'm like, dude, are you sure it's because of the creatine or because you're, the LGD, whatever, 40, that SARM that people take? And he was like, no, it can't be the SARM because it's a selective blah, blah, blah. It can't be the SARM. And I'm like, dude, you don't know what you're getting, right? A lot of these bodybuilders are getting quote unquote supplements. They're taking steroids. There was one guy on my server. I actually had to kick his ass out because he was being kind of cringe. But he was like, yeah, man, I'm losing ground. I'm losing my life right now because finasteride ruining me and creatine's bad for you, bro. Come to find out, this fucker's using Anavar, right? And I know I should keep it honest to an extent. Maybe not everyone's doing that complains about creatine and hair loss, right? But I think, there are some characters on these forums that just yap a lot, and it starts to, influence people in a negative way for them to assume that, oh, this one hair that fell out of my head, oh, it's because of that creatine I took 5 weeks ago. Really? So let's just get real about that, right? So I can ramble on for like 40 more years about this kind of stuff, but the reality is the overwhelming amount of evidence in the literature, and also just, when we compare signals in the real world in, case study reports or anything in, clinical trials, it shows us that creatine isn't raising DHT by any means, right? Make no mistake, androgenetic alopecia is primarily influenced by, one, your genetics, of course, and two, DHT, the amount of DHT you have in your body, right? And you have in your tissues at all times, near your hair follicles. The DHT binds to that, and then it activates a series of cascades that causes your hair follicles to miniaturize with each cycle and eventually die. That is a DHT-driven process, right? So if we're not seeing DHT being impacted due to creatine use, if we're not even seeing total testosterone and free testosterone being significantly impacted due to creatine use, then how can this thing actually cause androgenetic alopecia? People are going to argue, well, I mean, maybe it's causing hair loss through a different means. Okay, so if it's causing hair loss through a different means, then it shouldn't be an issue that these men in the study were not identified to have androgenetic alopecia, because then they would be having a sort of creatine-induced alopecia. That's the argument now. But they didn't even have that. So it's like a moving goalpost. All I can tell you is this. From the ample amount of evidence we have, it's not causing hair loss. So either you take it or you don't. The choice is yours. And honestly, this was kind of a boring video for me, but I'm done with this video. It is 3:47 a.m. and I have to go to bed and then go to work in the morning. But anyway, thanks for watching this video, guys. I hope you liked it. I hope I wasn't trying to get too sucked into the literature this time, but I ended up rambling and making the video go on longer than it probably should have. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I do hope to see you on the next one. Bye, guys. And also, my new website, my new company is out, www.folligens.com. That's FOLLIGENZ.com. And there you can get the liposomal monoxidil sulfate. Maybe you'll be on a back order if you try to order now, but we'll try to get it to you, right? Don't worry, I got you. Anyway, see you guys. Peace. Elevate your daily routine with Sulfogens, a lightweight serum that marries cutting-edge delivery science with premium conditioning ingredients to transform hair from dull and lifeless to vibrant, bouncy, and fuller-looking hair. Our advanced liposomal system encapsulates monoxidil sulfate in microscopic phospholipid spheres that not only protect and stabilize this active derivative, but also mirrors your scalp's natural sebum for seamless compatibility. These tiny vesicles glide on smoothly, ensuring an even, residue-free application that absorbs quickly and feels weightless, while directing key conditioning and antioxidant ingredients deep to the base of each follicle for maximum cosmetic benefit. So, inside each drop of Sulfogens, glycerin draws in and locks moisture deep into every strand of hair, preventing dryness and creating the appearance of fuller, more resilient hair. Vitamin E delivers antioxidant support, helping shield your scalp and hair strands from environmental stressors, while also imparting a luminous shine. Phosphatidylcholine contributes to skin barrier function, leaving your scalp feeling smoother and softer and enhancing hydration for a healthier looking foundation. Lectins, gentle plant-derived proteins, help reduce visible signs of dullness, improve scalp tone and texture, and also support antioxidant defense to maintain a fresh, energized look. Also, Sulfogens is free of alcohol, as well as propylene glycol, which is a known irritant in many cosmetics. We instead opt to use plant-based oils and natural butters that help moisturize the skin without the greasiness, unlike other comparable topicals. Now here's the kicker. When it comes to the stability of the products inside of Sulfogens, unopened, it stays fresh to up to 1 year. However, once you open that bottle and begin your journey, it maintains its peak performance for up to 4 to 6 months at room temperature, which is the recommended storage for Sulfogens. But you see, Sulfogen stands as a true cosmetic alternative to heavy retinoid layering or multiple styling serums. Instead of juggling separate conditioning, shine, and texture products, or even risking irritation with nightly retinoids, Sulfogens delivers moisture, smoothing, and lift, all in one lightweight formula. So get started today and visit www.folligens, that's FOLLIGENZ.com to get started.